The question has to do with how the Hawaiians celebrated the changing of the seasons. This came up. And what relationship that might have to spring festivals or Easter and things like that. And the first thing is, the Hawaiian, here we're in a tropical paradise, yes. But we're in the tropics, in a tropical area of the world, and we don't have seasons as strongly defined as they do in the temperate climates, both north and south, beyond this. I don't know how much you know about geography, but the tropical line where that begins is at the 23rd parallel, or latitude 23 and a half to be specific. And between that, north of the equator and south of the equator are the tropics. And we don't have a lot of changes of seasons. So for instance, the vernal equinox, the spring equinox it's also called, becomes very, very important in the temperate climates, but not so much here. So there were no particular spring festivals of any kind. The Hawaiians were aware of that tropical line, and they had a special name for it, a very sacred name for it. But the shining, I think the one in the north is the shining black path of Kane, would be the literal translation. And the southern tropic, the Tropic of Capricorn, is the shining black path of Kanaloa. But other than that, there were no particular festivals, or a little bit of a noticeable change is possible here, for instance, on Kauai. We're very close. The tropic line is 23.5 degrees, and Kauai is about 22. So there are some changes, especially with the exotic or foreign plants that have come in, and the birds that we find on the mainland who are here now. They tend to follow those seasonal changes a little bit. Well, in the process of looking over this and realizing that today is Easter Sunday, that I decided to do a little bit more research on that and give you some information I found that was quite fascinating, that I didn't even realize how that was calculated. When the Christian church was moving northward from Rome up into Europe, it became very important to find some ways to help convert the people to Christianity. And one of the things they used to do, even starting in Rome actually, was to incorporate local festivals into church festivals, wherever they could do that. And in the early days of the church, they decided to start to celebrate the resurrection of Jesus in the springtime. Now, it doesn't say anywhere in the Bible what time of year this took place. It was a desert area, could have taken place any time, but that was a very important time for all peoples in the temperate climates, a time of renewal and a time of rebirth from very ancient days. And so that's where it was placed. Then came the time to decide what point to choose. Now, interestingly enough, a lot of the early Christians were also Jewish in origin. And so the first thing they did was choose the Jewish Passover as the starting point. And for about almost 300 years of the early church, they used the first day of Passover as a beginning point, and had either that day was used for Easter, or they had a Sunday that was near it. Okay, so for a very long time, that's how they determined it. In fact, all the way, from about the agreed upon date as to when Jesus died all the way up to 336. Why, that's how they determined it. As they went further north in Europe, trying to incorporate other kinds of things into it, they found that in the Germanic or Teutonic or even Celtic areas, call them that, there was a goddess of the dawn. And her name varies a little bit, but Easter, that was her name. And so nobody knows how or why or who made the decision, but for some reason, in many of the countries, they used her name for the day of the resurrection of Jesus. It was actually a name that was based on the very ancient Astarte, down around from the Middle East. But at any rate, she was a goddess of the dawn, a goddess of new beginnings. She had symbols of the hare, actually. The rabbit came after they moved to the United States, but the hare is a same kind of a family. And what they used to say in Germany, I found out, was that, you know, in the old Astarte, or Hathor, as she was in Egypt, she has a symbol of the sun above her head. She has two big cow horns. Isis was another name. And then a symbol of the sun. And it used to be said that she gave birth to the egg of the sun. Well, in Germany, they had the hare as the symbol for the goddess, as a symbol of fertility. And so she gave birth to eggs. And the eggs were then given as gifts on this day. Also a symbol of resurrection, a symbol of newness, springtime, and gradually then of the Christian resurrection. Down in other parts of Europe, just the old original name having to do with the Passover was still there. The Pâques time. And so in French, Easter is still called Pâques. And the had a difference at one point between the Eastern Church and the Western Church. About the time they were changing over from the Julian calendar to the Gregorian calendar, right? So they began celebrating Easter at different times of the year and still do. Now, it became clear to me, I looked one time in a Christian manual to see how they calculated Easter. And it was almost impossible to figure out. And then later on, I looked at Easter itself and when it happened and figured something out that was much simpler, and then found other people who had done the same thing. It's popular to consider today that Easter always falls on the first Sunday after the first full moon, after the spring equinox. Right? Most of the time that's true, but not always. And some of the time Easter falls on the first Sunday after the first day of Passover. That's what happened this year. But not always. Doesn't work next year. So I went to find out, well, why is it different sometimes? Now, bear with me. This may be interesting to some people and not interesting to others, but I just want to show you what human beings can do. I had to write this down because it's so complicated. This is a simplified version of how they calculate Easter. It's based on the work of an astronomer in Australia. His name is Ronald Mellon. But anyway, here's what they do. First of all, Easter always falls between March 22nd and April 25th. It's always one of those days. The church doesn't use March 21st as the equinox. They have what's called an ecclesiastical equinox, and that's fixed at March 20th. So then here we go. This is a simplified version, okay? First of all, they have to calculate the full moon of the Passover. Right? And then there are tables that are made up to determine the full moon of the Passover. Okay. So here's how you do. You divide the year by, whatever year it is, you divide it by 19. Okay? Then there will be lots of decimal numbers. So you take the first three numbers of that decimal number. Right? Then you find the Passover full moon. Then you find numbers from three different tables. Okay? And what you do is the Passover full moon has a number, and then the first digit of that decimal, you look that up, and then the second digit, and then the third digit, all on a different table. And then those three numbers you add together. Okay? And then that tells you the particular day of the week. And then on that table, it tells you how many days to add to find the next Sunday. And that's a simplified version of the simplified version that I had to check out. All right? Yeah, thank you. Here's the point, and there is a point. The point is, here it was, the early church did not want to let nature govern the activities of human beings. And so they wanted to calculate something which was made with the conscious mind and fixed. Because nature is really, she's kind of messy. It's like, even when we say we can calculate when the sun crosses an invisible line and say that's the beginning of spring, even if it's snowing outside. Okay? Spring is when the snow starts to melt and the flowers come out. That's spring. But that can happen according to however nature feels that year. And that's pretty messy from a certain intellectual point of view. So the idea of separating from nature in order to calculate how things should be, it wasn't only there. We find this also in the East, in many different places, in many different ways. There are a lot of places in the world where they decided an intellectual understanding that is nice and fixed and solid, is much more secure than whatever nature happens to be doing. Following up with that idea came a time where what they called the Renaissance, where there were more and more people who did not want to be governed by the way the church thought only, so they began thinking differently. And then after that that kind of moved into the Industrial Revolution and the kind of science that separated itself from nature. And a way of thinking that happened. And like I said, it was not the only place in the world, but we know it most strongly from the West. Till what happened was nature began to be distrusted. And in people's minds and in people's hearts, in many places of the world, in many of the official ways of behaving, why that separation got farther and farther. And people became afraid of nature. And when they become afraid of nature, they become afraid of themselves. Hawaiians are often considered to be a place where they had a perfect paradise, where everybody was one with nature, where everybody, flowed so easily. And sometimes the American Indians are also considered in the same kind of a way, where they walked the earth gently, and all of this romantic nonsense. It's romantic nonsense if we look at the Hawaiians that way. It's romantic nonsense if we look at the American Indians that way. There were many people who did live with nature that way. There are many people in modern industrial countries who live with nature in a close relationship. They might have to limit themselves to the plants they have in their apartment, but they have this love and they have this connection. And there were those people, probably more of them because they didn't have the same kind of separating technology, but there were more of them perhaps in some of these other non-industrial civilizations. But that doesn't mean they were all that way. We find occasions here, for instance, in Hawaii, when we do the research, where they would mess up the environment. They would wipe out animals and plants to extinction without a thought for trying to preserve them. It's not the way the whole people lived at all, but there was that based on evidence that's been found. It's estimated that during the time of the Hawaiians in Hawaii, and please, this is nothing to do with blame, it has to do with understanding human beings, but there were probably about 70 species of mostly birds that were made extinct. The Maori, we know, when they landed in New Zealand, there was a 12-foot bird. 12-foot. Huge thing. Did not fly, had very small wings, but it had the same name as what's called the chicken here. It's called a moa. The bones have been found. And also, along with the bones, have been found the weapons of the early Maori. And these birds, hey, that's a lot of meat. These birds were totally wiped out, okay, before the first European ever got there. And again, we're not talking about blame, we're talking about how human beings will relate to the environment. Same with the American Indians. We've got to understand, for all of their connection with nature, which was a great deal, of course, because they had to have some connection, still, there were American Indians. Their way of getting dinner was to run 3,000 buffalo off a cliff and then take maybe half a dozen at most. That's hardly ecological, okay? And that's hardly a strong connection to how to do things, because they were capable of killing a few at a time, but it was much easier to just herd them off a cliff. Human beings are human beings. We can only do that, and we can only war with each other, and we can only war with nature when we've separated ourselves from it, and we stop understanding it. And it can happen anytime, anywhere, among any people. And yet we always have the capability of coming back, of paying more attention, of finding out where the moon is by looking outside rather than in a book, of taking notice when the season changes around you, of allowing yourself to feel and smell and touch the nature around you. We can all do that. To the extent that we do that, we become healthier in our bodies and in our minds and in our spirits. Now, doesn't matter what culture it was, even when there were people, Hawaiian or otherwise, when there were people who had to eat, why, they ate. We have to eat the beings or elements in nature. But in those places and among those people who knew what they were doing, they always did it with respect. Not all of them, like I said. Human beings are human beings, and it doesn't matter what the culture or time, you can always be separate. But for those who weren't separate, they would say thank you and have appreciation for the game that they were killing, for the food that they received. And today we can do a blessing for whatever food is on our plate. We can eat our hamburger or our fish or our noodles or our vegetables, and give thanks. Because it's the same kind of relationship. We can either separate it out and just not think about it, or we can think about it and have a deeper, closer relationship and realize someday, in fact, not just someday, right now it's happening, but someday we're going to be food. Right now we are food to an amazing number of creatures that live in our bodies and on our bodies. Some people don't like to think about that. but they're there. And we are food for them, and we'll be food for other things at some point. And it's all this great exchange, and it doesn't have to be fearful, and it doesn't have to be thought of as bad. When we live with it, and we love what we eat and what we share with and where we live and what we live with, or at least have respect for it, we enhance the world, and the world enhances us.